interesting that you're taking something that is historical, but from the perspective of an individual, you get maybe a sort of visceral experience. So I wondered about that for you because throughout the book, you have instances where you invent things and other things you preserve certain things that were historical. So can you tell us a little bit about that, like deciding there are certain things I must preserve but other things I have to invent maybe for empathy or other reasons?
Um, yes, I took a lot of artistic rights. The reason I did that was because, first of all, there's a lot of history and clear history on the on slavery, on the Middle Passage, um, the history that is on the Maroons. I went by two main authors. I mean, historians, and Richard Price. I don't know if you're familiar with Richard Price, but he's a famous historian of Black diasporic history. I also looked at, I cannot remember her name, Campbell. And those two books were the most accurate I could find. A lot of it is primary sources. Now, these primary sources are coming from white men from the area, from the era. So when you read that, you do have to imagine what is really the story that's not being told, or the voices that are not being heard. And so that is why I sort of played around with the reality. I also looked a lot at African history. I studied African history and the original African peoples that came, um, the Ashantis, the 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 people from Haiti that came. And I'm sorry, my brain, it's been a long day. I've been teaching all day. Yeah, so my brain not working. The Igbo, that's the tribe I was trying to remember. And I did look a little bit at their history, and I studied diasporic history. So I'm looking at just other countries too. I looked at the Maroons in Guyana. I looked at the Maroons in Suriname. I looked at the Maroons in South Carolina and in Louisiana. And I sort of brought all of those stories together and used my own imagination to feel out what the stories are. A lot of it sounds like, in my story, sounds like it's not, like it's made up. A lot of it is the myths of Jamaicans. Um, and I put the myths in there as well. For instance, if they said that the slaves used to burn down the plantations, I'm sorry, the Maroons, to burn down the plantations, they would tie um, tie dry grass on the tails of rats and set them loose. And that's how they would burn on the plantation. Well, recently I was just watching the long story on NPR, and they did that. So that's how they burnt on the plantation. It's based in Jamaica. So I don't know if it's because that author who that story is based on, her book is based on, has the same information as me, or if it's true. But I use it because who knows, who knows what was done. So I do play with that, and I like to play with magical realism. I am a fan of a lot of um, Gabriel Garcia and Isabel Allende. So I do play with magical realism as
Okay,
well.
that's interesting you mentioned that too, because with me, when I was working on my collection, I thought about, yes, these are about people who are living now or like in the recent history, but the kind of received story element was what appealed to me because any Jamaican you meet, they were either told a story, whether it's a duppy story or a folk tale, and so I felt like for me, even though nobody's telling me to do this, I felt like I had to be preserve certain things about the folk tale. So if I find out the story about how hen and hawk became enemies, I put my spin on it, obviously, but it was compelling enough that you keep that in there to add that mysticism and that element of as you mentioned about spiritism and the other world and but that's interesting, the idea of what do you preserve, because you're using history, you're looking at the what's the culture telling you, and you're also saying, well, I'm going to make it my own, but I also want people to know, look, this is something that people talked about. They hand down these stories from generation to generation. We hear about it, and it's interesting too about what you mentioned about the fact that a lot of the history is written by outsiders, people who aren't black or who aren't Caribbean, who may have been in positions of authority, and they say,
and had agendas, they, so yeah. And of course, and when somebody else is telling your story, then I'm sort of trying to reclaim our story. And so, to tell you the truth, when I'm writing, a lot of times I do not write. I know there are some writers who write, I'm not the only writer who writes like this, but my character drives the story. So a lot of times when I'm writing, I don't even know where the story is going. The story is carrying me along with it, and I just trust it and just go along, and I'm like, oh,
yes,
now I know what's happening. you know
I can understand that too
it's
because
a dangerous thing to
that would
do,
have,
because sometimes I end up in a corner, and I have to back out the corner and figure it out again. But it's also more exciting for me as a writer.
yeah, the beauty of it is that you rewriting is where the magic happens because you start out not really knowing, but then you go
Mm.
back and you put things in, and when people read it, they think, well, how did you know? I mean, it appears seamless because you do the work of going back to it and making sure it makes sense. But many times I do drafts of discovery. I can't always have like an outline. This is how it's going to start. This is how it's going to end. Let's go. Sometimes an idea comes to your whole, but most times it just starts with a character and you
It
say, all right.
starts with a character and it drives my ideas. I never have an outline. Never.
Yes.
I I never have an outline. And if I have an outline, then I don't feel like writing it. So it usually starts with a scene, a picture, an idea, or a very strong character. And
Okay.
and and then I just go with it.
I have a loose outline because right now I'm working on a novel and I have to have parts. And I think maybe it's interesting you said that too, because maybe that's what's preventing me from buckling down with it, because I have such a regimented idea of this is what's going to happen. And many times when I do sit down to write, it's something completely different from what I had thought. So I have the outline for my own security or maybe my own sense of some purpose, I don't know, or security, but it becomes what it wants to become. um
Yeah.
the other thing that jumped out at me when you were reading that section was the idea of naming and how naming is significant, because I used to just pluck a name from the air and say, is this sounding Jamaican enough, and use it. And then I realized it was a wasted opportunity because names have meanings. I recently found out, and I don't know if it's 100% true. I recently found out that my name means you have left me.
Oh.
For a long time, from like 2011, three different Kenyan students told me that it meant one who writes in the Luya dialect. And so I was like, oh, this is great. My name means something that I actually like doing. And then I met another Kenyan who actually spoke the dialect, and he said, no, it means you have left me. It's like it's another dialect that means you're in the process of writing. So it's a different one and it has to have an extra A in it. So I don't know. I want to kind of still keep that meaning, but it made me think if you're going to write about Jamaican or Caribbean people, names are important. You can put it in the story. And just like we see with Old Mother, her naming was sort of as a survival in a way. And so I think that's interesting. You can tell us a little bit more about that process for you, about thinking of names. How did you go about that?
In my story, a lot of the background characters have, I don't, in Jamaica, we tend to give people, and this is not just Jamaica. I think this is original to all cultures. That when we start naming people, it usually represents, either their trade or a characteristics about them. But even in modern day Jamaica, right? We give somebody a name based on, beanpole, and that name sticks,
Yeah.
or scatter teeth,
One of the characters is straight finger because his finger has an issue and it just
so
based on a
so
man that I met on a bus who had that problem. And so I was like, that's what they call you, don't feel any way about it. And he's like, no, that's just my name.
it becomes your name. It becomes your name. And so during the time of slavery, though, in Jamaica, a lot of the Africans were given names of the day that they were born on.
Mm.
Okay, they quasi, so on. Those are names of like the days, like the African days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So it's the day that they were born on. um the In my story, a lot of the background characters have these fake names: Tall Boy, Little Bird, things like that. But for like the main characters, I really did do my research. A baby is she was a naturalist, and so her name means flower in Ethiopia. And I know it's Ethiopia. It doesn't have nothing to do with West Africa, but that's her name. So yeah, so yeah. And so I did think about the names and about the meaning of the names. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
Mhm.
and that's something too with one of my stories, Finding Joy, where I found out that means joy. So it's like, how can I put this in the story would make it seamless and interesting? Because names, as you're saying, it's so compelling and interesting, and the fact that I mean, I didn't use this, but that just occurred to me, the idea that you would be called a certain name at birth, but then your pet name is something completely different, doesn't even relate. And it has something to,
I won't tell you mine. I won't tell you. It has something to do with my teeth.
okay, now I'm interested. You can tell me
I'm
off
gonna tell you.
air. You can tell me.
Off camera. All right. So another thing, though, but in my story and my writing, though, I do stop a lot. Anything I do stop, and I do. If I don't have the knowledge on that or information, I stop and I research it.
Yeah.
I research down to the shells on her wedding outfit. I researched that. When I was doing the funeral, I went and I researched the obia,
Yeah.
because a lot of obia, the thought of obia came up in there. So I did a lot of reading on obia. And so that obia is like Santeria, right? Or in voodoo in Haiti. So I
Yeah.
did a lot of research on that to make sure that the elements in there were accurate,
Okay.
were authentic. Yes.
All right.
Mhm.
So